It has become very clear over the last 12 months that international cooperation to developing countries is not keeping pace with the rise in extreme weather events and the tragic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lack of solidarity with nations that have contributed least to creating the climate emergency, and the lack of resources to vaccinate their populations in good time is an issue that the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction would like to draw urgent attention to on 13 October, the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. International cooperation can have a powerful influence on reducing disaster losses in countries trying to eradicate poverty. It can bring vital support to low-income countries struggling to implement their national strategies for disaster risk reduction. There are many good examples of development assistance to reduce loss of life by supporting multi-hazard early warning systems, restoring protective ecosystems, building flood defenses and cyclone shelters, to mention just a few. UN member states were absolutely right to include enhancement of international cooperation to developing countries to disaster risk reduction as one of the 7 global targets when the Sendai Framework was adopted in 2015. Now is the time to put words into action, because only together can we make progress towards a safer and more resilient planet.
Of the International Science Council. And what I want to do is to introduce a discussion on the most significant project the ISC has been involved in over the last few months, which is the COVID Scenarios Project. And I'll do so by making some introductory remarks and presenting some slides, followed by which we'll have a panel consisting of Elizabeth Jelen and Jana Singh, David Kaplan, and Enes Hassan. And I'll introduce those at the end of this presentation. In late 2020, the ISC convened a group of distinguished epidemiologists from around the world, from all continents, to consider what role the ISC should have in relationship to the pandemic. The group was chaired by Sir David Skegg, and over the coming weeks, several options were considered. It was recognized that while individual countries were dealing with their acute decision-making, there were a lot of longer-term issues that needed to be considered. As a result of that, and Dr. Salim Abdul Kalim, who was one of the members of that panel, suggested that what would be the most useful thing for the ISC to do would be to have a focus on the longer-term issues and longer-term scenarios broadly wrought, which this major reset, this major event affecting the whole of the planet might evolve to. So in March 2021, the ISC, in partnership with WHO and the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Organization, launched an exercise to examine the 3 to 7 year scenarios for COVID over multiple dimensions, and I was honored to have to chair that panel. The rationale was the pandemic is perhaps the most major inflection point in global history in the last 50 to 70 years, and has very broad consequences and may lead to a number of resets. We were concerned, particularly in late 2020, that with the emergence of the vaccines, politicians were starting to give the impression that the arrival of the vaccine meant the end of the pandemic. And that was even obvious then that that would not be the case. Thirdly, we were concerned that much thinking by governments was focused narrowly on the COVID health dimensions and not on the broader dimensions of the pandemic. And it was quite clear that there were a large number of gross inequalities and inequities going to emerge and already emerging as a result of the pandemic. We set up an oversight panel, which is shown here, including epidemiologists, social scientists, experts in the evidence to policy interaction, statisticians, government strategists, public health experts, bioethicists, 20 members of an oversight panel, and the ISC used some of its reserves to develop an expert executive group led by Ines Hassan, one of the panelists. And we also had a group of technical advisors dealing with some matters which I'll come up to momentarily. The target audience was obviously the governments and the multilateral system, but recognising that the work would also be of value to to ISC members themselves, other global actors, civil society groups, and so forth. The project goals were simple: to assist and inform public policy makers in thinking through and understanding the impact of decisions they make now, which might have long-term impacts over the next decade. Secondly, to put this into the form of scenarios, to understand the impact of these different scenarios, and thus identify the policies or system changes that would lead to either better or worse outcomes. The approach was very systematic. A large number of global experts across all the domains that were relevant or we thought were relevant to the pandemic were engaged to map out what scenario planners call the vectors of uncertainty. That is, what were all the various factors in play which might determine the outcome of the pandemic, ranging from obvious things like viral evolution to global vaccine stocks on one end, to societal responses, political responses, geostrategic issues, and exogenous events at the other extreme. Based on the work done by this rather extensive structural interviews, a number of experts were also engaged in working through most likely, best and worst case scenarios. And this work was supported by regional workshops and also repeated iterative meetings with the oversight panel, and also with various selected groups of government advisors and officials who were working on these same issues at national levels. And it enabled us to test a number of the messaging and the work that was being done. The work, therefore, had three basic components: defining the vectors of uncertainty and turning those into a visual way of representing how all these factors interplay, and I'll show you some of that work in a moment. Secondly, working through the scenarios that might emerge from that, and then finally, considering what would be the policy recommendations that we would make, and that is the work that is now underway, is bringing the report together for its completion. We started with a systems map simply because making sure that people we were engaging with thought through all the possible factors that might be in play and which might affect a wide range of outcomes as a result of this pandemic could be developed in a useful heuristic. I should say this is not a mathematical model. This is simply a way of describing and illustrating the relationships that would need to be considered. Is the screen not sharing? Is that better? Thought I was. I'm sorry, but it's not going to. Oh, here it is. Okay. We looked at the various dimensions of the crisis using a concept which was given to us by the Singapore Department of Strategic Planning, namely thinking about clocks. The point being that there are very, very many different elements to the map, to the outcomes. There's the health outcomes, the social outcomes, the economic outcomes, issues of citizen-state relationships, multilateral outcomes, environmental outcomes, and so forth. And each of them interact with each other, but each of them has a different tempo to them. And therefore, we looked at each of these clocks, and within those, the vectors of uncertainty which would influence those clocks, and they were mapped out into a systems map. The outcomes that we focused on are shown on this slide. Obviously, the first and most obvious is the impact on health due to COVID itself directly. But secondly, we're interested in the impacts on non-COVID health-related issues, issues of social well-being, issues of economic growth and economic equality, issues of inequities, issues of social stability, geostrategic and multilateral issues, impact on the science innovation systems, impact on the sustainability agenda, and lessons for future existential crises. This slide just shows just illustrates, and it's not a complete list, the various clocks across in the vertical columns, and some of the major factors that we saw as being the things that would determine the levels of outcome. So, for instance, obviously under the health clock, the rollout of effective vaccines is by far the biggest determinant of what might happen. But equally, we need to be concerned about the emergence of new variants of concern, impacts on the health system more broadly, and so forth. Under the social clock, for instance, we're clearly interested in the impact on education, the impact on mental health, impact on social and care system, etc., etc. And this horrible slide here shows you the rough systems map integrating the 7 levels of the clock. And when this map is finished and finalized, it actually allows one to dissect out each clock in detail, understand what you can influence and what will change and what it will do to other things in the map. It allows for different levels of granularity and analysis by clock layers. This is work which at the moment the program is complete, but it needs to be made into a more visually accessible, pretty form. The 3 scenarios that we have been focusing on are a most likely case, which is described by the orange dot here, a best case, described by the green dot here, a worst case, a red dot here. They are not the only possible scenarios. If you think about all the possible variations in these uncertainties in these different domains, one needs to think in terms of there being strong responses by governments in the multilateral system and weak responses by the governments and multilateral system. But of course, what that means depends on whether they focus only on the narrow aspects of health, or they look more broadly into areas like food security, economic, education, other domains. And equally, the outcomes will vary depending on what particular clock one looks at. So I'm going to go through these very quickly because these are draft and not complete. But what the report will show is if we look under each primary outcome domain, and in this slide, you see the state on COVID-related health and the impact on non-COVID related health, you see the impact, the most likely scenario shown in orange, with this, what I think from the various consultations we did seemed to be the most likely view of what it might look like in 5 years' time, through to the worst case shown in red and the best case shown in green. And there'll be obviously intermediates between these three pictures. Equally, it may differ very differently across geographical zones and by the nature of country. And we have work which is not, I can't report here, which tries to dissect out those levels of granularity. The slide shows some of the thinking around the levels on social well-being, mental health and education harms being the ones that have achieved the most focus. But there's obviously huge issues under the worst case with growing gender equality and violence concerns, and the best case scenario, which is possible, but perhaps hopefully over-optimistic. We'll talk more about the economic scenarios in the panel discussion ahead, but we can see differences. There are very many different possibilities in the economic scenario and in terms of inequities and inequalities as well. One of the areas which we will talk about in the panel is increasing concern about the impact of the pandemic on societal polarization, the changed relationship between government and the people that are governed, increased corruption in some places, concern about the state of democratic governance in some countries, and so forth. The worst case and the best case reflect that in different ways. Equally, a lot of attention has gone to the multilateral system, the extent to which geopolitical opportunism will be increased due to the issues related to unequal perceptions and supply of vaccine, export bans, trade issues, and so forth. Issues of geopolitics, the relationships between the superpowers could be affected either positively or negatively by the pandemic over time. And also issues related to vaccine passports and travel, which could worsen global inequalities. And again, the worst and the best case shift that in different directions. There's a lot of thinking about the impact on the sustainability agenda. Has this pushed the SDGs back, pushed progress back by perhaps a decade? Under the best case scenario, we would hope that this will be a wake-up call to accelerate progress on the sustainability agenda. But the worst case scenario would see the opposite. Equally, the impact on the environment and on future existential threats is part of the reporting process. And while not last, one of the key issues we should recognise is the pandemic has affected science itself. It's had significant impact on the move towards open science, good impact, but there are issues still remaining with data sharing. Digital divide is shown to be a big issue, as we know, and the concerns about misinformation have grown during the pandemic. And again, one can see how this scenario might be altered in one direction or the other, depending on how countries react and how the pandemic evolves. So the next steps for this project are to produce a report and a mapping tool based on the systems map for contextual use. We hope to release this in November of this year. Next year, we'll be conducting a policy development workshop to outline the policy implications in more detail. If the work turns out to be valuable to the policy community and the science community, we'll revisit the scenarios every few years, and we'll delve more closely into some of the selected clocks. There are many lessons that we will bring out in our report. Lessons for pandemic management, lessons for management of other existential crises, lessons for domestic and multilateral systems, lessons for enhancing evidence into policy, which has been very variable across the world, and lessons for science diplomacy. Clearly, we have the ability now with this, once this report and the toolkit is available, to look at much more detail at specific countries and regions, to develop in-depth country-level scenarios and analyses, and we would hope our members would use this toolkit to do exactly that. And so in conclusion, I think the project has shown that the ISC can bring multiple expertises together rather quickly to do some very substantive work. The projects provide a template for policymakers and experts to bring together evidence from multiple domains to look ahead over time and bring attention to where decisions made now could lead to better and more equitable outcomes. It highlights issues requiring a multilateral approach, and of course, vaccine access remains central to equitable outcomes. In conclusion, this project is trying to show how many factors interact to impact on long-term outcomes. And with that, we'll turn over and I'll introduce the panel. I'd now like to introduce the panel. Elizabeth Jelen is a senior researcher at CONICET in Buenos Aires. She's a world-renowned sociologist and has worked in human rights, the memory of political repression, citizenship, social movements, gender and the family, and has been a very active member of the oversight panel for this work, making sure that the panel's they're thinking through a lot of the domains around social care in particular. Professor Anjana Singh from Nepal is a professor of microbiology at the Central Department of Microbiology at Tribhuvan University in Kathmandu, but she's also a member of the Nepalese Academy of Science and Technology, and she's also a member of the oversight panel. David Kaplan is senior consultant to the ISC, an economist and professor of business government relationships at the University of Cape Town, and he's been heavily involved in this project from its initial conception. And Ines Hassan is a senior consultant of the ISC who was brought into the ISC specifically to lead this project, and she's had a big background in global public health policy. I'm going to ask each of them in turn to make comments related to a specific clock. And I think we'll start with Anjana talking about how she sees and views the health clock from the perspective of a clinician working in a developing country. Anjana?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Peter. First of all, I would like to thank this ISC for giving me an opportunity to present this, the long-term impacts of the pandemic on health. And we know that the outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 virus causing COVID-19 that has been declared a global pandemic by the WHO is a novel infection with a high rate of morbidity and mortality. COVID-19 pandemic is among the deadliest infectious diseases to have emerged in the recent history, and specific mechanism of its emergence in humans remains still unknown. Nonetheless, a large body of virological, epidemiological, veterinary, and ecological data establishes that the new virus, SARS-CoV-2, evolved directly or indirectly from a beta coronavirus in the SARS-CoV virus. And this is a group of viruses that naturally infect bats and pangolins in Asia and Southeast Asia. Scientists have warned for decades that such SARS viruses are poised to emerge again and again, identified risk factors, and argued for enhanced pandemic prevention and control efforts. Unfortunately, few such preventive actions were taken, resulting in the latest coronavirus emergence, detecting in late 2019, which quickly spread it, and it caused pandemic around the world. The risks of similar coronavirus outbreaks in the future remains quite high. In addition to controlling the COVID-19 pandemic, we must undertake vigorous scientific public health, societal actions, including significantly increased funding for basic and applied research addressing disease emergence to prevent tragic history from repeating itself. However, it's been affecting health and well-being, economy, social, education, and some of the other shortages, but I'll be mostly talking with health effects only. So COVID-19, it is produced and it has scarring and other permanent problems in the lungs, but even mild infections can cause persistent shortness of breath even after light exertion. Experts say that lung recovery after COVID-19 can take months for a person's lung function to return to pre-COVID-19 levels. However, breathing exercise and respiratory therapy can be a help. One study showed that 60% of people who recovered from COVID-19 had signs of ongoing heart inflammation, which could lead to common symptoms of shortness of breath, palpitation, rapid heartbeat, and this this inflammation, it has been appeared even in those who had a mild case of COVID-19 and who had no medical issues before they got sick. Some studies suggest that altered or loss of senses of smell or taste is about 60 to 80%, and chances that these people will see improvement in their sense of smell within a year. Neurologist Arun Venkatasan says some individuals develop medium to long-term symptoms following COVID infection, including brain fog, fatigue, headache, and dizziness. And also, COVID insomnia is an increasingly common complaint among COVID-19 survivors. Megan Jose, who is a rehabilitation psychologist, says that prolonged time in the ICU can cause delirium and strange surroundings, multiple mind-altering medications, isolation, and loss of control can leave patients with lasting and recurrent sensation of terror or dread, including post-traumatic stress disorder. Some survivors of illness seem to be developing type 2 diabetes signs after they recover from COVID-19. The Johns Hopkins Post-Acute COVID-19 team is a special multidisciplinary clinic to support the recovery of people who have had COVID-19, and similar clinics are emerging at other hospitals. Breathing exercises, physical therapy, medications, and other treatments can be a help in improving patients' gradual recovery in health. And due to use of lots of drugs like remdesivir and other combined drugs, these during the COVID-19 may develop multi-drug resistance in future. Those who are less immune might be in risk of getting other diseases as well. Due to lack of timely diagnosis, non-communicable diseases in future may arise or may increase. And COVID-19 can make blood cells more likely to clump up and form clots. While larger clots can cause heart attacks and strokes, much of the heart damage caused by COVID-19 is believed to stem from very small clots that block tiny blood vessels, capillaries, that is, in the heart muscle. Other parts of the body affected by blood clots include the lungs, legs, liver, and kidneys. COVID-19 can also weaken blood vessels and cause them to leak, which contributes to potentially long-lasting problems with liver and kidneys. Some of these patients are known as long haulers, have experienced symptoms for more than 6 months after being infected. The long-term effects of COVID-19 are still being not understood because of this new virus. And Dr. Jennifer Ross, acting professor of medicine, infectious disease and global health at University of Washington School of Medicine, she has reviewed the available literature about long-term illness connected to COVID-19 for a state Department of Health report, and found that many hospitalized with COVID-19 experience lingering symptoms such as shortness of breath and fatigue, or even memory problems. Months after leaving the hospital, even people who are not hospitalized can have a cough, fatigue for weeks after they are sick, she has recorded. And Lauren Nichols, who was diagnosed with COVID-19 on March 10, also told to Atlantic magazine that she had tremors for a month, a fever for 3 months, and night sweats for 4 months. And some of the patients in Nepal also having this kind of similar symptoms. And after 5 months, this Lauren, at 150th day, she had severe nausea, extreme fatigue, bulging veins and excessive bruising, or an erratic heartbeat, short-term memory loss, and gynecological problems, brain fog, and sensitivity to light and sounds. And she has also problem having gasping of air. And University of Maryland psychiatrist who had been working with COVID-19 patients estimates that between 1/3 to 1/2 of patients deal with some kind of mental health issues. In connection with this, one of my relative, Navina Singh, she also has a hair loss, fatigue, tiredness, short memory loss, and obese problem after COVID-19 infection. Similarly, this is a case study, Mr. Binay Maharjan, though there is no longer live coronavirus when tested, as his test showed negative for the coronavirus, but still suffered with severe debilitate. In Nepal, maternal and neonatal mortality rate increased after COVID-19 infections, and that is about threefold, which is really alarming. A suicidal effect effect is quite alarming, especially more in women, and women's health has been affected disproportionately. Long haulers effect or in another word, we can say National Institute of Health refer as a long-term COVID-19 symptoms as PASC, that is post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2. So it has been clear that people with certain risk factors, especially including high blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, obesity, and cancer and other conditions, they are more likely to have a serious bout of COVID-19. However, there isn't a clear link between these risk factors and long-term problems.
And
in
Jana,
fact, long COVID-19, I'm almost done, effect can happen in people who have mild symptoms. And there have been some persisting symptoms that could be due to organ damage or a persistent inflammatory or autoimmune response to other reasons. And CDC has also given that some lasting symptoms are fatigue, shortness of breath, cough, joint pain, and chest pain. And it also includes cognitive problems like difficulty concentrating, depression, muscle pain, headache, and rapid heartbeat and intermittent fever. Besides physical exercises in Nepal, yoga plus Tai Chi fusion is being practiced with a long balanced diet to stay physically and mentally healthy, where our total population is about 1,27,80,678. So these people, they have been already vaccinated. That means 25.8%. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David Kaplan, as an economist, when you hear from Anjana describing the raft of disease, morbidity, and affecting both developed but horrifically developing and low-income countries, the issue of the economic future of this pandemic is something that's key. And I just wonder if you'd like to make some comments on that.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Peter. Let me start with the growth story, our growth scenario. So what we're looking at for developed countries in China who've got access to vaccine, large stimulus packages, we're going to see very high rates of growth over the next short period of time. So for the G7, we're anticipating a growth this year of around 7%, which is historically unprecedented, and close to 6% in 2022. But there's a very sharp contrast here, because while the developed countries are growing, developing countries have very limited access to vaccine and very limited stimulus packages. So governments' financial resources are very strained, and developing countries have very little access to global capital markets. So they will benefit, developing countries will benefit from global growth because of higher raw material prices, commodity prices in particular, but growth in the developing countries will be much more subdued. So we are anticipating high global growth, probably 6% this year and close to 5% next year, but divergent economic growth. Growing economic gulf between developed and developing countries, which the IMF, quite rightly, I think, has recently termed a divergence. So that's our expectation about our growth scenario. But there are, of course, significant downside risks to this scenario. The stimulus packages will mean much more demand, but there's also a lot of pent-up consumer demand. People haven't spent over the process of Corona, and they may well raise consumer expenditures may rise. In combination, that means you're going to have a higher increase in demand. And if in addition we get disruptions in global supply chains, we get falling supply as a consequence, higher demand, falling supply, of course, we're in an inflationary situation. How do central banks react to that? They'll react to that by raising interest rates, and the raising interest rates, of course, will crimp growth, will make the growth much less. And if on top of that we get new variants of COVID arriving, we could have a very, very different scenario. The upside really comes for developing. What do we do about this divergent growth? Well, the divergent growth really means we have to pay attention to the situation in developing countries. And key here is that developing countries need access to global capital markets. Some more support from the IMF and from aid programs would also be significant. But the key aspect is more access to global capital markets. But the reason why developing countries cannot get access is because they are most developing countries, highly indebted. So there would have to be some form of debt relief, some sort of debt reorganization to make that possible. But that's the upside. The upside is, could we have that, and could we then have a global growth which would be high but would include developing countries? Let me turn now to the inequality scenarios. So there's no question that everywhere you look in relationship to COVID, a key theme is growing inequality as a consequence of COVID. So that the inequalities we saw prior to COVID have been intensified and exacerbated by COVID at every level: gender, ethnicity, age, but also critically between rich and poor. So of fundamental importance to address this inequality will be the character of the stimulus packages and government expenditures in general. Unless we get government attention and spending targeted at those most adversely affected by the pandemic, inequality will grow significantly, reinforcing the inequalities that we had prior to the COVID pandemic. So if we have those growing inequalities, we will expect, and our systems map draws these linkages, we expect that this would result in further political instability and lack of social cohesion. So that's the short-term scenario for growth and inequality. Let me turn to the longer term, because what can we expect after a horizon of, let's say, around 3 years? Well, I think there is a lot of concern that after 3 years, we may be looking at a possible crisis scenario. A number of factors may cause this. First of all, the stimulus packages run out. Secondly, the longer term impacts of COVID come to bear, such as the decline in education, people less well trained, effects on labor productivity, health effects that are very widespread, mental health and other health effects, and enormous social consequences. So if all these come together in say 3 years' time, we are going to be in a situation where we get declining productivity. We're going to have interest rates rising because governments will be severely indebted. And the likelihood, looking further down the line, is that we're going to get a marked economic slowdown. Now, if we get a marked economic slowdown, that will mean that we're going to get lower commodity prices, and developing countries will be faced with lower commodity prices, higher interest rates, and the difficulties for them will be intense, will be absolutely intense. So this is something that we need to be very well aware of looking into the future. So what is the upside? What is the upside? What is it that we can do and we can think about that might give us a more optimistic scenario? And here, the key rests with government. The key rests with what government does, the stimulus packages, but government expenditures in broad. If these spending packages, government spending in broad, is directed at enhancing productive capacity, there's effective programs for hard and soft infrastructure development. And this raises the productivity and the potential economic output of countries. Then this will also crowd in private investment. So what we're looking for is a crowding in of private investment, which will enhance labor productivity, higher remunerations, more labor employed, higher remunerations will also be the major factor lowering inequality. So this is what it's a historically important time as governments spend more and consider their expenditures, that their expenditures need to be addressed to raising the productive capacity and bringing more people into productive employment, into productive activity. Now, an additional thing that, of course, needs to be said is that crowding in private investment really needs to be around green growth. There's a lot to be said on that. I won't go into that here, but that is absolutely essential. So that in order to that growth that we need to crowd in as a consequence of better infrastructure, better hard and soft infrastructure, that investment needs to be increasingly directed to green if that investment is to be environmentally sustainable. A lot of issues, but I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. You've raised a lot of issues, but at the heart of it all are people. And I'd like to turn to Elizabeth to make some comments from the point of view of how people and how society, the society is responding and will respond in time to this pandemic. What are your big concerns, Elizabeth? You're muted, I think.
Hello. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you to Peter, to Ines, and everybody else in the team for this opportunity to participate in this exercise, an exercise that involves looking ahead beyond short-term urgencies. I would like to start saying that in the first stage of the pandemic, international and national governments called on scientists' advice. Epidemiologists, virologists, experts in vaccine development, and other specialists became the key providers of advice. Stay at home, wash your hands, social distancing, and confinement were the main strategies. How can this be implemented when there is no running water, when living space per person is minimal, when monetary income depends on casual informal work? Policies were not informed to the same degree by social science knowledge, which came in much later and very much as a secondary aspect. Reality showed the consequences. All kinds of pre-existing inequalities and injustices, from the global to the local, exacerbated and became much more visible to the world. In fact, I think that global multiple inequalities and climate change are the central issues in the world today. In the social clock of the project, several vectors of uncertainty were identified. Uncertainties in education, in health, in employment, in provision of care. The groups most affected are the elderly, women, children, and the young. And in here, I don't make the difference between countries, high income, low income, developed, underdeveloped, because in terms of social classes, the very, very poor, the refugees, the people in the developed countries suffered similarly to the large bulk of populations in the least developed countries. So it's not a question of how rich a country is, it's a question of how inequalities in the world and within each country are developed. The uncertainties in this social clock, unfortunately, are not so uncertain. Even the most optimistic scenario that Peter drew a few minutes ago is one in which it will be almost impossible to overcome the growing inequalities in life chances across the globe and within countries. Most key decision makers focus on economic recovery and on biosecurity. Few are prioritizing any of these critical vectors of uncertainty. Redressing inequalities involves not only targeting assistance to disadvantaged groups, it requires dealing with systemic issues of social justice and patterns of distribution of resources, focusing also on the top layers of income and wealth concentration, which are increasing so dramatically. There are few cases in which special taxes to the rich are being implemented. One can imagine the increase in provision of education and health services with the limitations that David just mentioned. Thus, we know that investment in education are urgent to rescue a lost generation. Health and mental health services have to be extended. Yet caring for people is a different matter. The crisis of care requires a transformation of the social organization of everyday life. During the last decade, social science research, especially from a feminist perspective, has shown the importance of the concept of care. There is a clear understanding of the social and political organization of care, which involves different combinations of four institutions or four forms: family, state, market, and community action. Gender, class, and ethnicity inequalities show up in the provision of paid and unpaid care work. Inequalities in the quality of care received, international differences and flows of care workers, I'm thinking of domestic workers or nurses, across countries and regions of the world. This scientific knowledge did not inform the policies implemented to face the pandemic. We learned from the experience of the pandemic that care of people has to be put at the center of policies. It cannot be taken for granted or as a labor of love of mothers. The labor of women in families and in local community organizations were the invisible and unrecognized sources of care and well-being when everything else failed, the market and the state. The urgency is to lower the burden of care in families and to recognize the role of community, formal and informal organizations. Defamiliarizing cares implies also a step toward diminishing gender and class inequalities. This cannot be done through market mechanisms and commercial care services. This cannot be done because the high levels of economic inequality that don't allow that. Active state action is required, both as a direct care provider, lowering thus the burden for women, and in promoting community organizations as a major recognized player in the construction of societal well-being. From a societal perspective, this is perhaps the major challenge that has to be faced today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, Ines Hassan, who has led this project from its inception, from early in the year, with a great team behind her, doing a lot of interviews, a lot of analyses, and now is charged with the burden of leading the writing of the report, which is a not insignificant amount of work. So, Ines, I think that there's many things you could talk about, but I think it might be interesting to reflect on particularly issues relating to the multilateral system and how you see the pandemic influencing that over time.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter, and thanks for having me. So, I mean, just in general, like in the global governance geopolitical clock, where it also looks at the kind of the multilateral institutions, we're going to see some positive aspects because of this pandemic. So, pandemic preparedness surveillance systems are going to be vastly improved, especially in, of course, wealthier countries, perhaps less so those with limited economies and weak governance. We'll also see some positive examples of global collaborations regarding some technology and knowledge sharing initiatives for improved equity, especially with regards to access to vaccines and hopefully other essential health goods as well. But still, there'll be many obstacles, and it will have resulted, unfortunately, in little change to our current multilateral system, which has been weakened because of more kind of protectionist policies, nationalism, and growing tensions between countries. And so, how much authority kind of the multilateral system has, and kind of the idea that it serves a global community will kind of be far from perfect, I think, in 2026. And that's what our experts are telling us. And undoubtedly, low and middle income countries will be the most negatively impacted by that, as always. And although there will be some movement in technology and knowledge transfer, like I just mentioned, a lot of this will focus on investments in national and regional production of kind of these essential public goods. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So because of the lack of global solidarity we have seen, we're still already starting to see these movements where there's kind of more regional hubs of like production. So we've heard that, there's going to be some regional production, an mRNA factory in Singapore and in a country in Africa, which will hopefully ease kind of supply to those parts of the world. And we'll start to see some of the benefits of that by 2026. But geopolitical opportunism, especially related to vaccine distribution and export bans still on critical raw materials, will continue. And those will have increased geopolitical tensions, especially between, the superpowers. And although the global power dynamics will have continued to change, it won't be very clear how this power struggle has strengthened any single country's position. Vaccines, of course, in particular, will have become a vital tool, and is now a vital tool for political influence, contributing to vaccine supply bilaterally, which is a positive thing, and hopefully more increases in funding of the COVAX mechanism. Countries like the US will probably have adopted more of a nationalist approach, and potentially ties with regions like the EU could be slightly weakened. And again, like I said earlier, change in kind of power and global dynamics, especially with regards to countries like China and India. And I mentioned briefly already, but although the pandemic has shown good global collaboration, which has been imperative to defeating this crisis and any global crisis, the multilateral system either will remain the same, is what experts are telling us, or will be weakened because of those tensions and also some deglobalization trends. But also, very importantly, continued insufficient funding in the system, which is really needed to help us not just deal with the aftermath of the pandemic and COVID recovery, but also to help us get back on track to deal with the sustainability agenda as well. I think that's it. I think we've run out of time. So yeah, back to you, Peter.
Well, thanks very much, Ines. In summing up, I'd like to raise 3 or 4 brief points. Anjana raised the issue that countries that there had been much warning that there was inevitably going to be a pandemic at some stage. And I think the deep question which all of us on this panel have in different ways been reflecting upon is, why is it that policymakers were resistant to the advice of an existential threat, namely the risk of a pandemic, and virtually no countries except for the countries that had experienced SARS before were in any way prepared. In fact, and it's interesting to extrapolate that from that to climate change, where the same resistance to real action, even though the noise has been said, is the response appropriate to the signal that's being made by the scientific community. The second issue is one that both Elizabeth and David alluded to, which is the issue of social cohesion. At the end of the day, social cohesion, humans are social animals. We live in societies, and cohesion is certainly under threat for multiple reasons in this pandemic. And when you look at the interactions on the systems map, so much comes back to the tensions that are there which could pull societies apart. And we must work hard to understand what we can do to glue them together. And Elizabeth has already spoken to a number of factors there that are so essential. The third issue I would, and of course related to that, is one of the things that's critical to social cohesion. That's trust between those who are governed and those who are and the institutions of governance. And in many countries, that's been put under threat. And finally, Ines has raised the issue of the multilateral system. We should not be blasé about it. The multilateral system has not done well here. There have been isolated episodes of some work done. The WHO did not itself shine itself in glory, and other aspects of the multilateral system have not done particularly well. It's worrying to me, and it's interesting to compare. Within a year after the Chernobyl incident, there was a global treaty, in fact, 2 global treaties on on global cooperation in the event of a nuclear accident, signed by all the critical powers, by over 190 countries. We're still having debate. The WHO, the World Health Assembly, is debating under very political terms whether or not a new pandemic treaty or new international health regulations are needed. We should be learning now, because this pandemic is the forerunner of other pandemics. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I'm going to thank Anjana, Elizabeth, David and Ines, and all the other members of the oversight panel, of the large team of people working on it, the more than 200 people that have been interviewed and being discussed, and invite you to look out for November the 18th, when we hope to release the first report. Thank you very much.
Alexandria. He also serves on a number of advisory committees for academic, research, scientific, and institutional institutions. He has a deeply impressive array of international awards and honors. He is one of the most impressive academics I have met, both for his productivity and his humanity. And his impact on the global public science policy interface is a model for us all. He is also capable of delivering masterclasses in public speaking. Welcome, Ismail.
Thank you.
Vint Cerf is one of the architects of the modern internet. He co-designed the TCP/IP protocol, which defines how computers communicate in a network system. Since 2005, he has served at Google, where he is now responsible for public sector business development. Feted by scientific academies and unions around the world, from NASA to the Swedish Royal Academy of Engineering, he has a formidable 29 honorary degrees. Welcome, Vint. Last but not least, we are joined by a figure familiar to many of you, Dea Reddy. He holds the South Africa Research Chair in Computational Mechanics at the University of Cape Town and is the outgoing president of the ISC. Welcome, Dea. Now, the events of the last couple of years around both the pandemic and the climate emergency have made clear the consequence of contested perceptions of science. We've seen positions that we hope to be fringe, providing leadership for entire nations. Scientists have become embattled figures in some spaces, and I don't know a single person who has not had at least one awkward conversation about the nature of scientific evidence as it relates to vaccines or climate. But all the global polls suggest that trust in science remains high. Is it high enough? And is the scientific community doing enough to shore up this trust? What are the implications for the ISC membership? These concerns are going to be addressed, and to understand this, we have to look at the extent of the problem we are facing and challenge ourselves about how we understand and measure public perceptions of science. We have a set of questions to discuss with our panelists today that allows us to tease out and interrogate some of these issues. Of course, we hope to hear from you, our audience, and I'll be taking questions from the floor throughout the discussion, so feel free to post the questions as they arise in the chat. And Mary, I'm going to start with you by asking a fairly blunt question. Are we facing a crisis in trust in science?
I think it's an interesting question. I'm not a scientist. I am somebody who came to the climate issue through a lens of human rights, which is why I talk about climate justice all the time. But I think there are lessons that we can learn from COVID. During this pandemic, it was collective human behavior that protected populations before the vaccine was rolled out. Secondly, I think that health scientists were listened to very seriously by any governments who wanted to deal with the problem. And the evidence is there that those who didn't listen to the health advice had far more deaths, far more people ill, a much worse economy. And that means that the argument of listening to science is reinforced. This is how I see it from a climate perspective. And so I do think that the survey is right, that trust in science remains high, but of course we have all the misinformation and the denial of vaccine and all that. And that's a problem. That's more a problem, I think, aggravated by social media, by the algorithms and by the way platforms, particularly Facebook, know that they will make more money by going to the dark side. So they allow people to go more and more to the dark side to make more money.
Thank you. That's, I think, Vint, we have to come to you because is it true? Do you feel like social media and the internet is aggravating the issue of trust in science?
Well, to first order, I think I don't entirely agree. Let me explain why. I do agree that there are feedback loops in the social media that lead people down dark paths. But I have to tell you that looking at people who twist statistics and misrepresent things, who are in fact would be credible in the scientific community, except for the fact that they are deliberately misrepresenting things, is a big problem. I have seen lengthy arguments that are backed up by what look like legitimate statistics that say that the vaccines are harmful, that they kill people, and so on and so forth. And that feeds a certain degree of confusion, at least, if not distrust, in the scientific community. So I'm very concerned that that people are using or abusing scientific terms and terminology and techniques in order to mislead people for whatever purposes that might be driving them. And that does worry me a great deal. The term alternative fact is a scary concept, and one which we are going to have to do battle with, I think, in this coming decade.
Ismail, I see you smiling broadly. Does this mean that you are in agreement with Vint, or do you believe that indeed it is the use of the technology as opposed to technology that's driving a crisis?
No, partially I agree with Vint, and partially I disagree, because I disagree on the point that there are ideological positions that have been taken by individuals and groups, and that regardless of the science that is in some cases overwhelming, we find the repetition of these alternative facts mostly for ideological purposes. Some of them, I mean, we were just today we're listening to the governor of Texas and the governor of Florida trying to ban mandates of vaccination. So it's really taking an active position, not just rejecting the information that is present. And it is sad to point out, as I think you have pointed out, and as Vint does, that in general, the public still respects the scientists. But then there is this mixture that has come in, the alternative facts and the social media. Whether it is in GMOs, for example, genetically modified organisms for agriculture and food, which has been fought by particular groups in Europe for almost 20 years, or it is the anti-vaxxers in America, we now see ideological positions that are being espoused by political movements that have no merit in terms of an actual debate, where they are not really trying to debate with the scientists, but in fact are trying to obstruct the message of the scientists. And that's a big challenge for the scientific community, which I think needs to do a much better job in how it communicates. And this is where institutions like the ISC can play a big role in being the voice of science, dealing with a range of issues from governance to ethics to risks that need to be discussed.
I mean, I do want to, I understand the point that you're making completely, but I want to pick up on something that Mary said, which is that, you know, the evidence is there empirically. We can see that the governments that responded to the science are the ones that performed best. This suggests to me a certain optimism that the evidence will still win out, that these governments will say, actually, you know what? When we look around, actually, it's probably worth listening to them. Do we feel, and Mary, I'm guessing you feel quite confident that that's going to happen. I see you're nodding. I want to ask Vint and Ismail, do you feel confident that that's going to happen?
Oh, I do not feel very confident about this. And the reason is that there is a backfire problem associated with the scientific process. Let me explain. I go to Ismail and I say, Ismail, I have a problem and I need some help. And Ismail says, well, what's the problem? And I tell him what it is. And he says, you should do X based on his knowledge. And so I thank him and I go off. 10 years later, I come back to Ismail and I say, listen, I still have this problem, but you've had 10 years to study this further. What is your advice? And he says, well, now that I've looked at this for 10 years, you should do Y, which is different than X. And now I could have one of two reactions. One of them is, thank you very much for suggesting this new response based on your research. But the other reaction could be, so you lied to me 10 years ago when you told me to do X, so I don't believe Y either. And to be quite blunt, I believe there are people who take advantage of that particular misunderstanding of science. Science is not absolute truth. It is the best approximation we have at the moment. And there are people who will twist that around and say you should distrust science. So I am not as optimistic as perhaps others.
Mary, do you have any thoughts or responses to that?
I have a thought in relation to climate, that it actually has meant that climate scientists don't necessarily communicate as well as we would wish they would. They've got better, but for too long, because I agree with Vint, it's not an absolute truth. But scientists were too careful about this in the beginning and allowed themselves to be exploited, if I could put it that way. I'm sorry to say that. Literally allowed themselves to be exploited in the climate context. Now, the IPCC has learned somehow and communicates better and is able to, say things that are meaningful in the political space. And that is important for scientists to understand how to communicate science well, rather than do it in the perfect science mode, which Vint was talking about.
Okay, and I think this is a very important point, because what we're getting to here are, I think, two issues. One is the lesson that it appears climate scientists have been, which is the tension, as it were, between the practice of science, which I was speaking to a scientist for a podcast that we're recording at the ISC, and he said, the practice of science is about reducing the uncertainty. It's a process of incrementally reducing uncertainty, whereas the practice of communicating science is about stating absolutes that people can make some decisions around. And that there's a tension there, which is very, very difficult to resolve, both for scientists and also for those who might be engaged in the communication of science. And I can see how climate science has really had to kind of grapple with that in quite a big way. And I think it's very helpful, Mary, for you to start to elaborate some of the lessons that climate science might offer the scientific community generally, reflecting on something like, for instance, COVID. I want to also come back to this point very quickly of, we have what we might think of as fringe movements. We talked about the local government in Texas. And for me, a challenge that I see is, how can we determine at what level a fringe movement or alternative facts become harmful? I mean, maybe it's okay, you're never going to convince everybody, and maybe that's okay, but can we take a position like that, or do we have the tools to do that? Should we even be trying to develop those tools? I see, Vint, you're saying that actually this is not, the governor in Texas is not fringe, and I think this is a very important point. Do you want to reflect it? Again, Ismail is laughing. I'm going to come to Ismail first, and then, sorry, go on, Vint, go on.
Well, I just want to reiterate that these people are in charge right now. They have authority and power, and they could force people to either do things or not do things. I worry about that, because it means that the power structure has been infected by fringe idiocy. Yeah.
Ismail. Yes, go on, Ismail.
Well, I agree that these are not fringe people. They're governors of some of the biggest states in the nation, and very prominent people in the Republican Party. But let's go back to climate change. Climate change, we are on the 6th IPCC report. The IPCC report, this is like every 5 years. We've not done it for 30 years. And practically every time the scientists say, what we said at the time was true, we were correct. We were too optimistic. Things look worse than what we reported on. And this has been going on every 5 years. And with a huge participation, hundreds of people participate in preparing these reports. Thousands of papers are reviewed and so on, to give you the consensus on the science. So it is sad that as we speak today, the present path that we are on is for increased emissions, despite all declarations in Paris and so on 5 years ago. In addition to that, even if every promise made by every government was implemented today, there would be a slight decline from that, but still growing in emissions. So we are very far from the kind of radical transformation that we hope to get in order to try to stay within 1 to 2 degrees. And if that is the case, in an area where the vast majority of the public around the world believes climate change is real, it is much harder to do it elsewhere. And I think Vint is absolutely right when he points out that science evolves, knowledge of science in science evolves. The best we can say is this is best we can say right now, given the amount of information and data that we have. But as we learn more, we may change our point of view. And there are new things that will come out. I mean, before this last year, there was no such thing as mRNA vaccines. This is a new development, and I did this with somebody, and I said, well, this is always the first time. Things are changing wonderfully on the science side, but not so well on the political side.
I think this is a very astute observation, and I'm going to turn to you, Daya, to get your reflection on the state of the crisis and the conversation so far. I just want to acknowledge a comment from the floor that says actually things become more complicated because of disagreement among scientists. I mean, this is an inevitable part of the process of scientific consensus building. But it is true, again, proving how we have a tension here between the process of scientific knowledge making and building and the communication of science. Daya, your reflection so far. I think you're on mute, Daya.
So I was. Thanks very much, Nick. Yes, I'd like to comment in two broad areas. Firstly, that of trust and that of communication. And I might even refer to the last comment from the floor that you just read out. Let me start with communication. I think that we've heard along the way evidence or examples of, first of all, why science communication engagement with the broader public is important, but secondly, the fact that it is extremely important that we, and let me refer first of all to the science community, but also broadly, that we rethink the way in which we go about it. It is really something that lies at the nexus between science education, public outreach, sociology, behavioral sciences. What is it that we want to communicate? Well, of course, there are the details. One would like to explain how vaccines work and how the climate models work and so on. But additionally, and perhaps even more importantly, we have to convey more broadly how science works. What is science about? What do we mean by consensus? And why is it that when Ismail comes back to Vin 10 years later and says, well, actually this is how it is, because my model has improved, I've validated it, we have much better data and so on, and this is the consensus. How does all of that work? What is the role of uncertainty? There's been a comment here about the fact that with regard to the COVID crisis, we've had plenty of evidence of scientists disagreeing in public. Now, scientists do disagree. This is part of the whole business of working towards a consensus. Let me stop there with regard to communication, because I do want to say just a few words about trust and come back to the point made in the latest Pew Research report and in other reports that, broadly speaking, there is evidence that trust in science is high. I think that it's really important to analyze that and to disaggregate it. So I'd like to refer to a report by the Wellcome Trust, 2018, is a few years ago, which comes to the same conclusion. But if one looks at how this plays out in the global south, the global north, Western Europe, the developing world, and so on, the levels are rather different. They're very high in Western Europe. In parts of the developing world, not so. With regard to vaccine safety, so this is pre-COVID, it's kind of the other way around. So I think that in order to understand where we have to channel our efforts in building trust in science, we have to understand what the response is and what the nature is of trust or mistrust in science within different communities, not to mention policy makers as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Daya. I think this is a very important point that you make about the value of disaggregating audiences. I would agree that it's perhaps not the most helpful thing for us to be talking about global audiences as if that was a monolithic thing, because actually trust and distrust is expressed variously and driven by different factors in different contexts. There are a few questions that have come in, and some of them relate to the response, which we're going to get to in a minute. But there is one question which I am going to ask Vint, because it speaks very specifically, I think, to an issue that he's already spoken about quite passionately. Do we pay too much attention to fringe ideas? Do we, in fact, risk amplifying the marginal or dangerous ideas?
Very possibly so, because in the very act of refuting a fringe idea, you may give credibility to it because you have just spent time and energy to refute it. And people may ask, what is your motivation for this refutation? So I do wonder whether we are spending more time refuting fringe ideas than we are helping people understand what the real facts are. So I invite my colleagues to try to opine on that.
I'm going to come to Mary in a second to reflect. Oh, sorry. I see, Ismail, you're indicating that you were quite keen to respond to that. If you could do that very quickly, and then I want us to move on a little bit to talk about drivers. Yes. Mm-hmm. Go on, Ismail.
Okay, I wanted to just follow up on what Vint said. They tell politicians who are campaigning in the United States, stay on message, and they have developed it into a fine art to slough off questions that don't somehow enable them to message across. Unfortunately, we don't do that. We, the scientists, every time somebody asks us a question, we get into a discussion and an argument about it. So this idea of staying on message, people complain about the CDC and others that their messaging is not very good and so on, but that's partly because knowledge is advancing, new evidence comes in, and scientists change their mind. But scientists have to learn how to stay on message with the fundamental messages and stick with them in order to strengthen the political movement towards adopting the kinds of things that we think are absolutely essential, and then try to confine the disagreements push them at the margin and not let them disturb our fundamental messages.
Okay, thank you for that framing. And Mary, now I want to ask about the drivers of the current situation. You have suggested that technology, of course, is a big part of that. And we've also heard Ismail is implying that actually there is space really for us to improve the way that scientists engage with some of the borrowing from some political communication models, as it were. Do you see other drivers of the current situation which might be exacerbating our inability really to respond to these issues of distrust?
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I want to, in a way, build a little bit on something that Ismail was saying earlier about how serious the situation is in the alternative facts that Vint mentioned. I am very worried as chair of the elders about democracy in the United States. Very, very worried. I see a real dysfunction in the system that doesn't seem to be correcting itself. There isn't a dialogue now. The fact that, January the 6th and all the rest of it, and all the, Republicans covering for Trump, and it's almost unbelievable. And yet it's deeply, deeply worrying. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Another thing I think I wanted to say was, when I message about climate, I ask people almost always when I speak now, I'll probably do it this evening when I'm speaking here at the TED Countdown for Climate, where I'm based in Edinburgh. We need to do three things, everybody. First of all, to take the climate crisis seriously, personally in your own life. And to do that, you need to, make a commitment to be doing something you weren't doing yesterday, like recycling a bit more carefully, changing your diet a bit more, whatever it is. But also, and this is Catherine Hayhoe's big message in her new book, Saving Us, we have to talk about it to everyone at all times. It has to become colloquial in the community. It's amazing how little we talk about climate in real life, even though people now know it's affecting us. The second step is to get angry with those who aren't taking steps. And that's obviously governments, cities, investment, business, corporations, et cetera, the fossil fuel industry in particular. And thirdly, and we don't do this enough, we have to imagine this future that we're going to be hurrying towards. And I was at a climate lab storytelling event this morning, because I'm very keen on storytelling. That was what my book on climate justice was about. And there was a lot of reference to imagining this world. After all, we've got to get there, more or less, by 2030. That's 9 years away. And I don't think scientists are talking enough about imagining this world.
I think this is a really interesting observation. And so, I'm also reflecting on the comments you made at the beginning of your intervention, Mary, and I'm wondering, is there a suggestion that we need a particular mode of engagement in a strong democracy, which is quite different from how we might engage with a weak, fragile, or faltering democracy?
It's hard to say. I mean, at the moment, my preoccupation is what happens before COP, at COP, and alongside COP. Before COP at the G20 coming up very soon. Many of the, a number of the G countries, big ones, China, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, have not made commitments. Others, Australia, Indonesia, etc., have made commitments, but not nearly ambitious enough. On the finance side, Italy, as chair of the COP, ought to be paying more. So should France, to make sure we have that 100 billion before we go into COP. And then at COP, we have to actually do an assessment, which I think is doable, to see whether we are aligned going forward with 1.5. As Ismail rightly said, we're not at all aligned now. The synthesis report said we would increase by 16% between now and 2030 under the present trajectory. So we need to take stock, and then the governments have to make themselves accountable for closing that gap in the every year post Glasgow, post this year. And then thirdly, alongside that, all the things in sectors, in the methane agreement that is important, and all those other things have to take place.
Yes, no, and I can see actually that what you're talking about really is a multidimensional term of engagement. And clearly what you need are champions at all levels of society with various types of expertise. I mean, it is properly what we might call a transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary operation.
Absolutely.
Ismail, I am going to turn to you now to ask, do you feel that that we've covered the drivers of the current problem enough? Are there any drivers that we haven't made mention of so far?
Yes, I think that we have at least three major drivers that we have not looked at enough, and which I believe are going to be very central to this kind of debate and the relationship between the science community and the public at large and politicians and decision makers. The first of these is indeed what I would refer to as ethics. I served on a special panel by the US National Academies of Science to try to answer the question, when should the techniques of the new biology be used on humans and embryo research? And people sense the other end of the life pattern, when, as I say, in my father's time, there was nothing as straightforward as whether somebody is alive or dead. Today, it's a question about who puts the plug and who has the authority to pull the plug, and when do you put somebody on respirators, when do you stop doing it? The new technology gives us new kinds of questions where the ethics haven't been sufficiently developed. And this is true not just of the questions of medicine, which are going to increase in the years ahead, but also in the questions that are intergenerational responsibilities, or as Mary has said, climate justice. People who did the least to create the problem of climate change are the ones who are going to suffer most, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where famines and so on will occur. So ethics to me is a very important area, and we must find new ways of discussing these issues in order to develop evidence-based regulations and science-based policy. Second point is governance. Governance generally of how the scientific enterprise is carried out, and the balance between the private sector and the public sector, and the degree of transparency. And luckily, a lot of the scientific community is behind the open science platform, the open science movement, to keep everything available to everybody. And the last point really is this notion that we have, you have data, a lot of data, big data, but data, when it's organized, becomes information, and when it's explained, it becomes knowledge. But societies need more than knowledge. They need wisdom. They need the ability to pull people together, to include, and so on, which is not at present within our paradigm. And I think the idea that science really advances by confronting ideas, by challenging ideas, and testing them. And we have either evidence supports it or it doesn't. And this is, I think, a technique of advancing, which, however, has the seeds of also planting doubt, because you are confronting all the time new ideas, sometimes fringe ideas, against conventional wisdom. But I think, as Vince said earlier, that not every fringe idea is worth keeping, and conventional wisdom evolves over time as well. So these are the three drivers that I see that are going to affect this kind of dialogue.
What's interesting for me about this is that, within the Public Value of Science program at ISC, we have a panel of experts, and there is a freedom of expression activist on that panel, Courtney Raja. And she says, what's really important is for scientists to be engaging with gatekeepers. So, really thinking about things like internet governance and freedom of expression around journalists, because those are the kinds of people that are mediating the data and the knowledge making chain, as it were, that value chain that you're referring to, Ismail. And what you have pointed out is actually, indeed, this is an important sector for us to be thinking about. Vint, I couldn't help but note the comment that you made about the need for quite actionable recommendations from science and scientists. And of course, this, and I know now we're leaning a bit towards how to respond, but I'm mindful of the time, and I think we probably need some, to start giving that some thought. I'm going to ask you just to elaborate a little bit on that, particularly in light of a question from Jeffrey Bolton, where he says, actually, by advocating a specific policy, do scientists risk losing that part of their credibility that comes from their perceived independence? And indeed, such advocacy may, in the heat of public policy debate, even lead to corruption of evidence and minimization of uncertainty. So do you see a tension here between being able to provide actionable solutions or to contribute to actionable solutions, and again, the very process of scientific inquiry?
I don't think that these need to be in tension with each other. I think that what is important is a scientist who chooses to advocate a particular course of action needs to explain what it is that leads the scientist to that conclusion. So what is the scientific evidence that drives a particular course of action that is advocated? And the big issue here is to make sure that the advocacy can't be misrepresented as personal interest or some other corrupt influence. And again, that goes back to being able to show what the scientific evidence is that leads one to a particular policy or another. The same argument could be made in the COVID case about, do you wear a mask or do you not wear a mask? What is the evidence that tells you that masking is a useful thing to do? Similarly for vaccinations and the like.
Mm-hmm. Dea, I'm going to ask you again for your thoughts on some of these questions, but I want to just pick up on what Vint has said there, because I think I sometimes wonder whether or not those scientists operating in the public sector, so outside of the private sector, where you have actually quite sophisticated commercial machinery, have a political or conceptual blind spot about the way that scientific consensus might be engaged or taken up, the ideas that actually you say what you feel, the evidence is there and people will act on it. It doesn't account for the fact that sometimes if you say something that has enough consequence or is disruptive enough, that there will be people who will be actively lobbying against this. And how do we respond to that particular challenge? Dea, I'm afraid I'm going to ask you to reflect on that. Sorry, you're muted again, Dea.
Yeah, sorry about that. No, look, indeed, what you're describing is a reality, and you're referring to the scientific community, in this case, the scientific community in the let's say in the public sector as a homogeneous entity, which it most certainly is not. And once again, if one were to disaggregate, then I think that one would find evidence of what you're describing. But it does, it does bring me back to the matter of communication by scientists in relation to the public in particular, but also to policymakers. I'd alluded earlier to the fact that we desperately and urgently need to rethink the way in which we communicate. So I think that early on in the session, Nick, you had referred to what the role of the ISC might be. What is the position of the ISC in relation to these kinds of challenges? With regard to this particular issue of communication, we and by that I mean the scientific community has a responsibility to communicate its science. And of course, we do so through journals and the like, but to communicate its science more broadly in an accessible way and in a comprehensible way, which is not to say that each and every single individual scientist has the responsibility to go and do their best in communicating to the general public. We, as the ISC and our member bodies, have a responsibility to find ways of ensuring that that is pursued in the appropriate way. Which brings me to my second point. We, again, the scientific community, I think have gone badly wrong in the recent past, and maybe at present as well, in the manner, with regard to the manner in which we communicate, which has brought allegations of elitism. If one goes back to GMOs, allegations of elitism on the part of the scientific community, instances of scientists being completely disrespectful towards the public. So, we're not referring to, I'm not referring here to individuals who are rampant anti-vaxxers. If one takes vaccines, there are members of the public who are hesitant for one reason or another. There are moral intuitions, there are cultural contexts which come into play. How do we go about discussing science in those particular contexts? I think that we have to reflect on where we have gone wrong in this regard in the past, and what we have to do in order to ensure that we engage effectively and in a respectful way with the broader public.
Thank you for that very, I think, timely and important intervention, Dea. And Mary, I'm going to ask, do you think it's true? Has the scientific community been guilty of that moral outrage of leaving one behind?
Well, let me explain what I was thinking about when I was approached to become a patron of the ISC. I didn't know about the ISC. I had to look it up, and and I saw, to my pleasure, to my interest, that it was an amalgamation the year before of two different bodies, one on the science in a more pure sense, now I probably get given out to for using that word, and the other, the social sciences. And I thought that was a great strength of the ISC, that they would somehow try to bring them together. And let me, if I may, just very, very briefly, quickly rather, tell you a story about the Paris Climate Agreement, which isn't fully understood. Mm-hmm. I was the special envoy of the Secretary General before Paris. I was witnessing what happened. I saw the informal ministerial meetings were very boring, except for one voice. Tony de Bruyn, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, kept saying to his fellow ministers, do you want my whole island to go under? Do you want us to no longer be a sovereign people? Do you want us just to buy land and migrate to another country and have no sovereignty, etc., etc.? Then the marching in the street in Paris of the poorest countries, the Climate Vulnerable Forum of 48 countries, the indigenous peoples, the young people, 1.5 to stay alive, to get the 1.5 into the goal. And then the High Ambition Coalition formed in Paris. And that was led by Tony de Bruym, joined by the European Union, the United States, and others, with the real purpose of getting 1.5 degrees into the text. And when we got that new goal of staying well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 degree, the scientists had to be asked, could you please look at this? Because they seem to have given up on 1.5. I don't know, maybe one of my colleagues can explain. But anyway, the Paris Agreement asked the IPCC, and that was the source of the special report in October 2018 on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And that was so important because that was where we learned we had to reduce by 45% by 2030. And it's the whole, the whole dialogue now of COP is that dialogue. But the scientists would not have led that, So a bit of humility by the scientists would be called for, I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I think this is a fascinating story. I'm going to ask actually Ismail if he has any reflections on this as what do you take away from that scenario about how we communicate effectively for policy impact?
I think you are absolutely right that most of these things are not done by just scientific reports. I see something spotlight.
We can hear you. We can see you.
You can see him. Okay. I think, for example, Greta Thunberg had more impact than half the scientists working in IPCC because she brought forth with an enormous amount of sincerity and passion the feeling of a younger generation who is saying to us, what are you leaving us? We are going to have to live with the results of this. We, the young people, she was a teenager at the time, and she really had a very powerful impact. So I think that the amount of impact is not just the amount of data and studies that we put forward, but over the medium term, not even the long haul, over the medium term, cumulative work done in science does create a consensus, and that consensus can be later on translated into a political consensus as well. The question, though, is that on many of the issues we are facing, we are in a race with time, and whether we can do stuff quickly when we have lobbyists and huge financial interests playing important roles, I think is a very big challenge. And I think that some of my colleagues who say, well, behavioral change, when people will do that, they will stop eating beef and they will ride bicycles and give up on their cars and etc. But I'm not so sure that they will do that. People see people dying and still refuse to take vaccines. So I'm not sure that 30 years from now is enough of a challenge to make people transform their daily lives. But every little bit helps. But more importantly, I think, is the stark way of putting forward intergenerational equities, or as the case happened with the islands, the small, the SIDS, as we call them, these islands are going to disappear with sea level rise. And what happens there? These are very dramatic moments that I think can help galvanize movement on scientific material that is being established in advance.
Okay, and so Vin, in the 5 minutes that we have left, I think we have a very sobering reminder from Ismail that, the crises that we're facing are really very time sensitive. And we've also heard that actually for all of the relative success, actually, of climate science, we are still not where we need to be. So it suggests to me that we really have got to be making some kind of change. Something needs to be expedited. What would your message to the ISC membership be? What should they be doing?
I would suggest two things. The first one is to provide messages that can reach individuals that tell them what they can do individually that will in fact make a difference, because too many people say, well, it's just me and I have one car and I'm just one out of billions. And so, you know, what difference does it make? We have to help people understand what difference individual actions can make. And second, we have to provide incentives for parties in the commercial sector and other sectors that are generating huge amounts of greenhouse gases. Those incentives need to drive them towards decisions that reduce that output.
A very useful summary. I think what strikes me actually with the first suggestion is that, of course, messaging is important, but also we need to be thinking about those as audiences in the first place. You know, I think very often we think of policy spheres and we think of 15 people, usually men, sitting around a table, but we don't think actually, in fact, we have to think more comprehensively. It's a bit like Mary was saying, you know, you are describing what is a vast interdisciplinary exercise. And for science, there is often this conceptual blind spot around disaggregating audiences and thinking, if, as you're saying, Vint, let's think about what individuals can do and recognize that there are different types of individuals in different contexts and so on. And so we need to be finding ways to access these groups and to have some kind of dialogue with them. I'm going to turn now to Ismail and ask you, Ismail, very quickly, one or two things that you think the ISC membership should be doing in view of where we're at and the challenges ahead of us, specifically on communicating.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I believe there are two things that we should be doing as the ISC. One of the things that we do have is an enormous membership that is all over the world. And I think we can and should be able to develop more of what I will refer to as infographics that are nice, easy to read, summary presentations of information, not necessarily in complex material, and ask our membership to use that to reach out further so that we have a constant outflow that deals with the social media by our membership, supported from the center with the best that we can do in terms of simplifying and presenting the latest and best science.
Okay, thank you. Was there anything else? Is that it that you wanted to? Yeah. Okay, and Mary, I'm now going to turn to you and ask you again, actually, what do you think the ISC membership can be doing in the current context?
I would like the ISC to communicate in very climate justice terms, the injustices of climate change and the urgency of, the fact that we're not on track for a safe world. To talk to people in terms of motivating them, as we've said, to take their responsibility at all levels. And I've mentioned, make it personal in your own life, get angry about those who should be doing more, and imagine this world. We haven't talked about that. Imagine this world we need to be rushing towards. For goodness sake, we have to be rushing towards it in 9 years. It will be a much healthier world. There won't be the fumes of fossil fuel that kill 9 million people a year with indoor and outdoor pollution. There won't be, we'll be regenerating, regreening. There are innovations in agriculture that I'm very interested in, based on the kind of Moderna approach to vaccines that are, using molecular biology. Scientists need not to just talk about molecular biology. They need to talk about what this means for ordinary people, in their lives, and get them excited. If people are excited about the future, they'll work for it. If they're afraid it's going to cost them and be unaffordable, like clean energy being unaffordable, and how do I insulate my house? We're not going to get there.
No, and I think this is a very inspiring note on which we can end, to think about what would science communication look like if it was driven by visionaries.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that we have run out of time. I know there were several comments and a number of questions that we did not get to, but as you will appreciate, this is a rich and particularly live stream of conversation. And I think we would really need quite a few more days to be able to build consensus. But I really need to first thank the patrons for the time that they have committed for the conversation here today, and indeed for their continued stewardship and support to science as a global public good. The ISC depends on their engagement and championship for science to be transformative and responsive to our contemporary global challenges. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us and for engaging so actively. And of course, my gratitude to the team behind the scenes who've been keeping the General Assembly ticking along. Now, I'd like to take just a quick moment to let you know about an occasional paper which is discussing the latest science on science communication and some revealing global surveys, which we published on the 25th of October to coincide with the UN Global Media and Information Literacy Week. Our hub, Unlocking Science, the result of our partnership with BBC Storyworks, will be launched on bbc.com on the 9th of November. We'll also continue to discuss these issues at the Berlin Science Week with a panel on the 10th of November, which will be looking at prioritizing institutional responses. And over next year, we'll have a series of webinars addressing issues around these responses. And you can sign up to the ISC newsletter for further details on all this if you haven't already signed up. And now we will enjoy some live music from Christoph Spannenberg, and then we will move into the inaugural International Science Council Awards. Thank you, everyone.
Dear members of the International Science Council, dear guests and colleagues, thank you, Christophe, for the beautiful and uplifting piece of music to celebrate the ISC Awards. It's my great pleasure and honor to open the first ever awards ceremony of the Council. The ISC vision is of science as a global public good. The ISC is committed to support of the development of all science, from discovery to application and including the full range of disciplines, from the natural to technological to behavioral, social, and data sciences. Today, the ISC celebrates scientific achievements by individuals and groups of individuals whom we are recognizing for being innovators in international, interdisciplinary scientific research, science education, and outreach, for bringing scientific knowledge into the public domain and for promoting the free and response practice of science. The ISC Governing Board established the award program in 2020 with 5 award categories: science for sustainability, science for policy, policy for science, scientific freedom and responsibility, and early career scientist awards, including 1 award for each of 6 world regions. As a response to the call of nominations, the Council received more than 100 nominations for the award. My sincere thanks go to the ISC members and the partners who prepared and submitted nominations. The ISC Award Selection Committee, that comprised of distinguished scientists and science policy experts, worked intensively to select best candidates for each award and to recommend them for the awards to the ISC Governing Board. I am very grateful to the members of the committee for their excellent contribution to the awards program. Finally, my congratulations go to the first ISC awardees for their outstanding achievement in science and promoting science as a global public good. Oh, well, now it is time to announce ISC awards awardees, and please join me in welcoming our host, Christina Occhiello, an international journalist who covers global stories based in Paris, France. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. A warm welcome to this first ever International Science Council Award ceremony, recognizing the extraordinary contributions to science by some of the field's best innovators. And what a challenging time it's been for scientists. There seems to have been one disaster after another. First climate change, then COVID-19. But thanks to their efforts to develop treatments and vaccines, we can now more or less go back to normal. And who knows, maybe next year I may even get to see you in person as opposed to behind a screen. And hopefully by then too, we may even have serious action to tackle global warming. That would be good news with climate talks just around the corner. These are just some of the examples of what good science can do, and some of the things our awardees are already doing. How about we go and meet them, and hopefully they can help me brush up on my own science skills. Sadly, though, I think it will take another ceremony for that, but never mind. Before we go to our 2021 recipients, let's just recap why we're here. Today, we'll be announcing 10 prizes in the following categories: the Science for Sustainability Award, Science for Policy Award, Policy for Science Award, Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award, and 6 Early Career Scientist Awards. Now, to get here, they had to beat off stiff competition. Nothing difficult for our first laureate. He's one of the foremost scientists in China, recognized for his work in radar remote sensing and big Earth data science. He's also come up with his very own Silk Road, nothing to do with investment in railways, but a digital version linking cross-cutting research themes with sustainable development. I'm talking about none other than Professor Huowao Dong Guao, who scoops up the Science for Sustainability Award. Professor Guao is one of the most recognized scientists in China and well known internationally as a member of the UN 10-member group to support the technology facilitation mechanism for sustainable development goals. He has actively contributed to and participated in international efforts towards sustainability, including playing a leading role in setting up the International Research Centre of Big Data for Sustainable Development Goals. The platform his team has built aims to integrate big Earth data for SDG monitoring and prediction and will have a global impact. Let's hear now from Professor Guo, who is accepting the Science for Sustainability Award.
I'm Hua Dongguo. It's a great honor to receive this prestigious award. I feel truly humble, and I'd like to thank my team, colleagues, family, and friends for their support. Science is crucial for sustainable development, so I have advanced bigger data and SDG science satellite due to launch next month. I have also pursued interdisciplinary science and data sharing applied to the SDGs and founded the International Research Center for Big Data for Sustainable Development Goals. I hope that with this award, I will be able to motivate young people to incorporate data-driven approaches and help grow the next generation for innovation. To sustain our digitized society, capacities for science-based decision-making must be enhanced. To this end, ISC's role is essential. Thank you.
Professor Guo will receive, as will all our awardees, a stunning print by award-winning scientific photographer Carl Garth, who specializes in microscopy art, essentially art under a microscope. Dr. Guo's award is a fine art print entitled Yellow Lichen, a spontaneous emergence of order out of chaos. Just think of Nietzsche's Zarathustra novel, where he says you need chaos to give birth to a dancing star. In this case, the chaos is a crystalline formation that appears out of a chemical soup, photographed using a microscope. Well, if you didn't quite get that, join the club. Carl's work is rather peculiar, but it's nothing short of beautiful. He fuses art and science through methods of advanced microscopy. To explore his work further, just visit council.science/awards. Finally, our awardees will receive a framed certificate from the ISC. Coming up next, we look at the first of our 6 Early Career Science Awards, and this next laureate is also a big data specialist. Her vision is to make the scholarly communications ecosystem more inclusive. In 2012, Dr. Ariana Becerril-Garcia co-founded a platform that allows people in Latin America, the Caribbean, Spain, and Portugal open access to journals. The network, called Redilic, gives visibility to journals published in Ibero-American countries, thus making them more accessible to a large audience. Dr. Becerril-Garcia has used the web and open data to ensure that collections of ancestral and indigenous knowledge, epidemics, and COVID-19 have been accessible in Latin American languages. Let's hear now from Becerril-Garcia, who is accepting the Early Career Science Award for Latin America and the Caribbean.
It is a huge honor for me to be the recipient of the 2021 ISC Early Career Scientist Award for South America and the Caribbean. I feel so privileged not only for this very special award, but for the fact that the recognition comes from the International Science Council, whose vision is to advance science as a global public good, which is exactly the driving force of my entire scientific work. I have been committed to research and innovation for the strengthening of non-commercial open access publishing and the democratization of scientific knowledge, essential conditions to tackle emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic. The developments encompass artificial intelligence and semantic technologies to enable scientific information to be connected into an upper tier of science as a global public good that could both provide a universal benefit and accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I am very fortunate to be at the Autonomous University of the State of Mexico in Redilic, accompanied by a very talented mentor and colleagues. I also feel very lucky to have been able to share the pathway with organizations such as Claxo, Amelica, and UNESCO. This award will be a reminder that we are many minds and wheels sharing values and visions, and it will inspire me to work even harder. I truly believe that a disruptive innovation can be reached to achieve equity, multilingualism, and epistemic justice in knowledge generation and communication for the common good. Thank you very much.
She will receive a print of a crystalline chemical cocktail of metal salts, photographed under a microscope, of course, that resembles the top part of a tree where the main trunk breaks up into branches that diverge out into a crown. Continuing with our early career awards, our next recipient has had to get around a weak infrastructure and lack of funding in Egypt to carry out her research, but that didn't stop Dr. Shima Enani from becoming the first Arab scientist to study microbial proteomics, essentially the study of microbes and proteins. And it's proven very useful during the fight against COVID-19 in Africa, because her research has helped to reveal the microbes that spread in the community, thus helping to develop an effective vaccine. No doubt that the World Health Organization would be very interested in Dr. Enani's work, given the shortfall of vaccines for Africa. And it's no wonder that the associate professor from Suez Canal University has taken on a leading role in tackling COVID-19 on the continent. She's done so with the Next Einstein Forum and the COVID-19 Clinical Research Coalition. So without further ado, please join me in congratulating Dr. Enani, who takes home the Early Science Award for the Africa region.
Hello, everyone. I would like to deeply thank the International Science Council for selecting me to receive this year's award for the Early Career Scientist in Africa. About my work, actually, I am a microbiologist working mainly on bacteria using different omics techniques like genomics, metagenomics, proteomics, and metaproteomics, trying to elucidate bacterial molecular functions through the identification of virulence factors, antimicrobial resistance determinants, proteins, and others. Receiving the International Science Council Award in this time in my life is very encouraging for me, and it is considered as a gift that crowned my scientific journey. I hope that people in society all over the world realize the importance and the demand of science for saving life. Also hope that scientists community put their goals to let science serving the society and solving the community's problem. Thank you.
Now, we've all heard of the World Wide Web, but did you know that there was a Wood Wide Web? The Carl Garth print awarded to Dr. Enani brings to mind the mycelium matrix of fungi that forms the basis of the Wood Wide Web, connecting all plants and trees of a community into a giant interconnected network. The Wood Wide Web not only serves for communication between plants and trees, but also allows for the transport and distribution of essential nutrients among them. Now, this next laureate has co-founded several important institutions and Pan-African programs, including the African Light Source Initiative, which aims to build a facility to help researchers tackle some of the continent's biggest issues, such as Ebola. Indeed, Dr. Sikatsi Mitawinga, because that's who we're talking about, has sought to show how advanced light sources can revolutionize scientific research. Dr. Mitawinga has also promoted research and education in minority-serving institutions and has spent decades shoring up ties between physicists in Africa and the United States. Congratulations, Dr. Mitawinga, this year's winner of the Policy for Science Award.
To the ISC President, Daya Reddy, to the Governing Board, and the entire General Assembly, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this prestigious award. It's a culmination of a long journey over the last 3 decades of my involvement in developing countries. I'd like to thank my wife, Estella, and 2 daughters, Makazi and Sharifa, for their many years of support throughout all of my travels and intense work. I'd like to thank at MIT Chancellor Phil Clay for connecting me with resources to do this work. I'd like to thank my involvement and collaborations with Philemon Jawaha, the Director General of Science, Engineering, and Innovation for South Africa, and Simon Cornell at the University of Johannesburg. I'd like to thank Michelle Spiro and Bruce McKellar, the current and past president of IUPAP, for their support and encouragement during my involvement with the C13 Commission on Physics for Development. I'd like to thank James Burakane for the great partnerships and collaborations over the years. I'd like to thank the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine President Marcia McNutt and her colleagues, Ana Ferreras, Chris O'Brien, and others for their many years of support. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Shirley McKendall, Noel Blackburn at Brookhaven, and Eric Shepard at the National Science Foundation for their support. Despite all the turmoil in the world, I'm extremely optimistic, and the ISC Award will push me to do many more things in the future. And for that, I am most appreciative. Thank you very much.
Dr. Mutawengo receives this print titled Exquisite Flower by Carl Garth. A chemical flower spontaneously unfolds from a central nucleation point, the starting point of a crystal, during crystallization. This chemical flower was made from a mixture of health supplement powders mixed in a solvent and then recrystallized. And no, it's not for eating, but can be admired without moderation. Now, our next recipient is a man who doesn't mind getting his hands dirty. He loves soil, so much so that he even got the UN to create a World Soil Day. That's right, there's one every year on the 5th of December, and that's all thanks to Professor Winfried Bloom. This prolific academic has got us all talking about soil, it seems. He served as Secretary General of the International Union for Soil Science for 12 years and has organized dozens of conferences with a global impact. As chairman of the Committee of Experts for Soil Protection at the Council of Europe in the early 90s, Professor Bloom developed a new definition of soil functions to improve understanding by politicians, administrators, land users, and the broad public. Professor Bloom has not only sowed the seeds for policymakers and their understanding of soil science, but he is sowing the seeds for future generations across the globe by initiating a master's level course in natural resources management and ecological engineering that spans from Vienna, Austria to Lincoln in New Zealand. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Bloom, the winner of this year's Science for Policy Award.
Distinguished audience, I thank the International Science Council for conferring to me the Science for Policy Award 2021, thus recognizing not only my scientific achievements, but also the importance of my field of science, the soil as the basis of life. This award is the highlight of my professional career as a forest engineer and natural scientist. It also confirms my way in developing new concepts through the combination and application of different kinds of knowledge. In the future, science can support and promote the sustainable development of human societies if it is able to explain in an understandable way the complex interdependencies between nature and the social, economical, and technical impacts of human activities to the broad public and to politics.
Professor Bloom will receive the print titled Rays of Dawn, named for its early morning hues casting down on a cornfield. An apt choice for a soil advocate, wouldn't you say? And if you look closely, you might even see faint stars in the sky. Very poetic. This image was made from a mixture of medicinal medications and health supplements photographed under a microscope. Continuing with the theme of the environment, our next recipient is one of the leading voices on climate change and health in Canada. Dr. Shirley Harper's award-winning research has brought Indigenous people's voices, experiences, and priorities into international decision-making about climate change. Dr. Harper has been actively engaged with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, being nominated to the IPCC's Gender Task Group by the Government of Canada, and is a lead author for 2 IPCC reports summarizing the health impacts of climate change. Dr. Harper has notably co-led a program that uses science and Indigenous knowledge to strengthen health systems in response to our climate crisis. In addition to her work with the IPCC, Dr. Harper has also advised the United Nations and the World Health Organization. Simply put, our Early Career Scientist awardee for North America is an outstanding scholar and international leader in climate change and health. Congratulations, Dr. Harper, for your award.
I wanted to express my heartfelt thanks to the International Science Council for this award. I'm so honored and really humbled to have been selected for the Early Career Scientist Award in North America. As a climate change and health researcher, to me, this award really recognizes the important role of research and researchers in addressing climate change, and also the power and significance of meaningful community partnerships in research. It highlights the importance of bringing local voices, experiences, and priorities into international decision-making about climate change. Of course, climate change is a team science, so it's not just my sole effort that's brought me here today. So I wanted to thank my generous, honest, and really steadfast mentors in both academia, but also within the communities that I serve. And I especially wanted to thank those mentors who nominated me and provided me letters of support. I'm so incredibly thankful to all of my colleagues, community partners, and students who inspire me, guide me, and motivate me every day. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that climate change can be a threat multiplier in the health system. Over the last year, we've all seen the health impacts of the record-breaking heat waves, droughts, and floods that intersect with the challenge of COVID-19. But I believe that together, through team science and meaningful community partnerships, research is up to the task of responding to the global calls for emergency action on limiting climate change and supporting public health.
Dr. Harper will receive a fine art print of salicin, an anti-inflammatory medication, which was photographed using polarized light microscopy. Essentially, it was lit up by a microscope. And this formation brings to mind a plant native to the semi-arid and tropical climate of Africa called sticks of fire. Who knew that anti-inflammatory medication could be so fascinating? Well, I hope you're enjoying as much as I am the interplay between art and science to produce such beautiful imagery. Let's turn our attention now to Asia, where another early career researcher has been taking the field of optoelectronics by storm. We're talking about everything from solar cells to LEDs. Dr. Aditya Sadanala from the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore has developed one of the world's most sensitive absorption measurement techniques called photothermal deflection spectroscopy. This technique measures the rate of absorption in solids, liquids, and gases. Dr. Sadanala's research has notably helped rural communities in India make their wood-fired cook stoves more efficient. He's shown that flexible electronics can address some of the energy-related challenges facing remote communities. Please welcome Dr. Sadanala as he accepts the Early Career Science Award for Asia.
Thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak here to this august audience. I would like to thank everyone who supported me directly or indirectly for reaching this stage in my career till date. My research is mainly focused around the energy theme, inspired by India's needs, but targeted at the global energy and climate challenges. This ISC award is a significant recognition to my team's efforts in this direction. I hope to move forward with renewed vigor and motivation in bridging the gap between the scientific community and the society. Moreover, I would also like to work on accelerating the transformation of the society for securing better conditions for our future generations. Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Sadanala receives a fine art print image showing 4 large crystals surrounded by an extremely thin crystalline film of vitamin C. The thin film was photographed under a microscope, which reveals the strikingly colorful patterns. now from Asia to Australia and the Oceania region, where we meet our next early career awardee. She is a professor of the brain and mind and has unlocked one of the most feared neurodegenerative disorders in our society, dementia, an illness that was brought to the big screen this year in the movie The Father, where we saw actor Anthony Hopkins become a prisoner to his own mind. Dr. Moiran Irish also witnessed the devastating effects of dementia in her own family. But instead of being defeated, she came up with pioneering research to show how our imagination can help break down dementia. Her landmark 2012 study was the first worldwide to demonstrate that semantic brain networks support the capacity to envisage the future. And it's not just neuroscience that Professor Irish is being recognized for. She's also a fervent women's advocate and has promoted positive role models of women in science at the high school level through her Science in Schools program. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Irish of the University of Sydney, this year's Early Career Science Laureate for Australia and Oceania.
It is a great honour to receive this award from the International Science Council in recognition of the work that we've been doing at the University of Sydney. I'm really delighted that our research has been recognised in this way and immensely grateful for this opportunity. As a cognitive neuroscientist, I aim to solve some of the biggest mysteries of the human mind. How do we remember the past in exquisite detail? How do we project forwards in time to imagine the future? What brain networks underlie these complex capacities, and why are they so vulnerable to disruption in dementia? Over the last 10 years, I have been chipping away at trying to solve this puzzle, to understand how the brain shapes our past and our future. In doing so, I hope to provide new insights into the computations of the brain and to break new ground in the diagnosis and treatment of dementia. Thank you.
Professor Irish receives a print from Carl Garth that resembles a ghost gum tree native to Australia. The image is made from a mixture of iron and potassium sulfates imaged in polarized light yields. Well, the future is also bright, or at least that's what our next laureate hopes. Dr. Jory Rožilić has dedicated his whole career to highlighting pathways to a better future, in which global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius. With the COP26 climate conference just around the corner, his work couldn't have come at a better time. Rožilić's work has helped inform global decision-making in climate policies, and he's a regular contributor to the annual UNEP emissions gap reports. Last year, he was in the top 1% of researchers most cited in the field of environment and ecology. And if you still don't understand what climate change is all about, you can always watch Rožilić on YouTube, where he breaks down the burning issues into bite-sized chunks. It's precisely because of his commitment to making his research accessible to all that Dr. Rožilić is picking up the Early Career Science Award for Europe. Congratulations to him.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely honored to receive this award from the International Science Council. In my research, I try to understand how we can connect what we know about our planet to policy. Ambitious climate change mitigation has been a key focus, for example, by showing in the years leading up to the Paris Agreement in 2015, how global warming can be limited to 1.5 degrees, and subsequently how this can be done in sustainable ways that promote societal resilience. I'm particularly honored to receive this award from the ISC because of its own groundbreaking climate science to policy work over many decades, which is a mission that remains important to date. Providing visions of how we can transition to a sustainable future and engaging with society so that people can imagine their futures as well makes me hopeful that indeed we are able, in this very decade, to put our world on track towards a safe, just, and climate-resilient future.
Dr. Rožilić will receive Seedlings by our artist Carl Garth. Here we can see the striking similarity between patterns found in plants and those found in crystals, to the extent that one could be fooled into thinking that this picture was indeed one of plants. It's not. It's in fact a crystalline film formed from a chemical cocktail consisting of various metal salts photographed under a microscope. Well, sadly, we're coming to the end of our award ceremony and its beautiful art. And what better way to conclude than with our penultimate prize, the Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award. Without the ability to think, question, and share ideas, much of what we've discussed today would not have been possible. Protecting this right is exactly what Scholars at Risk has done over the past 2 decades. It's a network that protects scholars from conflict, persecution, and political unrest by arranging temporary research and teaching positions at partnering institutions, thus providing them with a sanctuary. Their work speaks to the very essence of what the International Science Council is all about: to promote the practice of responsible science and ensure that expertise is universally accessible and benefits all. The work of Scholars at Risk has lifelong benefit for individual scholars and their families, but also serves to preserve their skills for the benefit of a wider society. Thus, their work directly promotes science along with other academic disciplines as a global public good. So without further ado, let's hear from Rob Quinn as he accepts the award for Scientific Freedom and Responsibility.
Thank you to the entire ISC community for the honor of recognizing Scholars at Risk with your 2021 Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award. Our mission at Scholars at Risk is to protect scholars who face threats to their work, their well-being, and even their lives. It's difficult, emotionally challenging work, and there's simply too much of it. Too many of our colleagues around the world are facing threats and need our help. It's also deeply rewarding work. We have the privilege of working on behalf of individuals who value truth and truth-seeking, scientific process, and the sharing of scientific discourse and results for the broad public good, despite the risks. We also have the great privilege of working with a community of institutions, associations, and individuals who are similarly dedicated to the values of higher education, so much so that they open their hearts, homes, and campuses to offer sanctuary to threatened colleagues. They deserve this award, and I accept it on their behalf. This award will help raise the visibility of our work so that perhaps more institutions and associations will get involved, and together we will help more scholars, scientists, and researchers at risk. As is so often stated, the 21st century is the knowledge century, and this means that we expect fantastic scientific discoveries and innovations. By protecting scholars and promoting academic freedom, we can make sure that these don't just benefit the well-off few, but rather serve the broadest public. We can help make sure that the knowledge century is also a humane, equitable, and just century. On behalf of Scholars at Risk, thank you for supporting us in this effort, and thank you for this award.
Scholars at Risk will receive a Carl Garth print made from a mixture of medicinal medications and health supplements photographed under a microscope. Reminiscent of yellow and blue sunlight shafts illuminating the leaves of plants, this image is one in a series that resembles summertime in the cornfields. That beautiful image wraps up our inaugural award ceremony. Before we go, I'd like to invite Daya Reddy, ISC President, to say a few words on behalf of the governing board. Thank you for celebrating with us the achievements of all our winners. They've taught me a lot, and I hope you've learnt a thing or two. And I hope you will join us in advancing science as a global public good. Here's Daya.
So dear colleagues, as a global organization, we, the International Science Council, work to promote research on key global challenges, to increase evidence-informed decision-makings at all levels of public policy. We engage across a range of activities that are aimed at developing better policies for science and scientists. And of course, we strive to protect scientific freedom and promote the responsible practice of science. So there's a great deal going on at any time, and it really is appropriate that we recognize those scientists and organizations whose work and whose achievements in the context of science as a global public good are of the highest quality, and who in this way bring great credit to the scientific community. Today, we've had an opportunity to recognize such achievements, and it is truly cause for celebration as we hear of the successes of our inaugural group of awardees, including, I should say, an inspiring group of early career researchers, and pay tribute to and honor their exemplary achievements. May I then add my warmest congratulations to all of the awardees. Well done. You bring honor not only to yourselves, but to our entire community. I extend my very best wishes to you for your future endeavors. As a global organization, dear colleagues, we, the ISC, work to promote research on key global challenges to increase evidence-informed decision-making at all levels of public policy. We engage across a range of activities that are aimed at developing better policies for science. And of course, we strive to protect freedom, scientific freedom, and promote the responsible practice of science. So there's a lot going on at any given time, and it is appropriate that we recognize those scientists and organizations whose work, whose achievements in the context of science as a global public good are of the highest quality, and who in this way bring great credit to the scientific community. Today, we've had an opportunity to recognize such achievements, and it is truly cause for celebration as we hear of the successes of our inaugural group of awardees, including, I should say, an inspiring group of early career researchers. And so we pay tribute to and honor their exemplary achievements. May I then add my warmest congratulations to our awardees. Well done. You bring honor not only to yourselves, but to our entire community. I extend my very best wishes to you for your future endeavors. That concludes the formal proceedings for the day. We will now have some music, after which there will be once more an opportunity for networking. We'll have a further networking opportunity tomorrow at 12 noon, Central European Summertime, after which we proceed with the formal agenda. Thank you very much all for your attendance and for your contributions today. Thanks.